Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. The internet's potential to perform political miracles has been a source of both hope and disappointment for many grassroots movements. We remember that the Bernie Sanders campaign tried to master the meme to mobilize a young, eager audience. Equally, we ascribe Trump's electoral victory in 2016 to seemingly leaderless internet misinformation. Many of such events have been the subject of academic study, but research is often slow to keep up with the rapidly changing scene. Internet cultures are constantly evolving, and yet they evade theory. If a researcher tracing the role of the meme to the politicization and radicalization of online communities struggles to keep up, what hope does an artist have? Today, I'm speaking with Joshua Citarella, who is an artist and the author of Politigram and the Post-left. His practice is at points that of a content creator, at others of an ethnographer, sometimes of a benevolent online edgelord. Citarella's practice starts with the understanding that it is impossible to predict what the next generation of meme posters will be interested in, and whether the memes will reach beyond the tiny echo chambers. What is clear is that mainstream politics, particularly the politics of the left, remains afraid of these unruly communities that can just as easily turn to the dark corners of the demonized alt-right as they are to carry the flag for Bernie. Politigram and the Post-left is just one of multiple projects that Citarella has released through his self-publishing channels and directly to his supporters. Despite this unsanctioned mode of production, his and his community's productions appear to reach the kind of audiences that would make some academic publishers green with envy. Joshua remains active in the art world too. At the end of this episode, I'll include the audio track from one of his recent video works published by Dis. I think this relates to the controversial essay How to Plant a Meme that we discuss in the interview, so do stay tuned to the very end. As ever, you'll find links to many of the things we discuss in the episode notes. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to meet you.
Right, well, listeners who've been tuned in properly will recall that only a week ago I interviewed Mike Watson and we talked about memes quite a bit. And today, I think we're going to repeat some of these tracks, but in a very different perspective and in a completely new level of detail. Joshua, I want to find out first about who it is that you are. You're not an academic. I think that will be quite clear to our audience within a moment. But are you an artist? Are you a researcher? Why are we talking?
Yeah, it's funny. There's not another person who does this job. So maybe I can just tell you my background. I'll tell you what
Go
it is
for
that I
it.
do now, and then together we can figure out what the appropriate label for that thing is. I guess I studied art. I went to the School of Visual Arts. I studied photography, graduated in 2010. I've taught at SVA in New York. I've taught at RISD. I've been an outside advisor for various undergraduate and graduate programs. I've shown in galleries and museums for probably 10 years now. So I consider myself an artist, but I guess looking back, my studio practice has kind of dissolved or evaporated, transformed into this content stream where now I make podcasts and Twitch streams and I publish articles and PDFs. And I've spent probably the last, I want to say, 5 years writing about radical online Gen Z politics, very extremely online Gen Z politics, not red versus blue Democrats and Republicans, but anarcho-primitivists versus transhumanists, and pan-constitutional monarchists versus Juche, anarcho, accelerationist, libertarian, whatever.
Okay, we might have to slow down already.
There's a lot. Well,
I'm-
it's the nicheification is infinite. On the long tail of internet culture, there is an infinite number of genres and political ideologies, and I've spent the last few years studying those things.
Well, let's click with art for a little moment. I mean, I'm looking at the video feed. There's no art behind you. The wall is perfectly white and blank. But there was a moment in the kind of gallery and museum practice that you might have been part of, in which we talked about post-internet art. Now, I appreciate this is a very cringeworthy term by now, but could you maybe talk about your belonging in that world and how it is that you've moved yourself online with your interests?
Absolutely.
What brought you to that kind of aesthetic rift?
Broadly speaking, I was part of a peer group, a mini generation of artists that lasted just a very, very few years in hindsight, called post-internet art. A lot of these people came up on Tumblr and on Facebook and were essentially the early adopters of social media platforms and used that to bootstrap a art career either to institutional success or market success. And it also, I think, was the most formative thing in my education, having these reading groups that I had already graduated at that point. So I was making art and I had a set of interests that I really cared about. But through these successive reading groups spanning probably 10 years in New York City at the intersection of art and tech, I
Mm.
learned things that were really relevant and were different than what I'd been taught in school. And I attribute my analysis to meme culture in general being informed by those reading groups. So I really think it was the post school activities and peer groups that like informed my ideas, what I write now, and what I look at.
Mm. Gosh, I mean, you wouldn't be the first art school graduate to realize that art school doesn't necessarily prepare you for the real world, whatever the real world
Not at
is.
all.
And actually, the real world is part of my next question, because the book we're talking about is called Politigram and the Post-left. And I think we're going to have to define both of these terms. Politigram, I guess it's sort of easy. We're talking about the portmanteau of politics and Instagram, but there's a little bit more to it. And I'm particularly interested in how whatever Politigram is relates to politics of the real world. You've already said that you're not interested in the kind of left versus right, but I think it's important to capture as much as it is possible at this stage the relationship of the meme sphere and those kind of cultures that you already referred to the politics and the cultural or politics of the people who don't touch these spheres.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to describe it in maybe two eras, which is how Politigram existed when I wrote the book, which was published originally in October of 2018. So it's been quite a while. And now we are recording this in, what is it, May of 2022. So that's a lifetime of internet history. So when I wrote the book, Politigram, I would broadly describe it as a community of Gen Z teens who posted outrageous, sometimes insightful memes and essays, and got up to trolling and had like very active discords and would pursue their own education through sharing PDFs and things like this. That age group was generally 12 to 17. It was unbelievably young. It
Hmm.
was almost entirely undocumented. So I bore witness to a level of young people getting radicalized or politicized that was a pretty unique window in internet culture, in just how platforms operated, but also in American history and global history.
Hmm.
Um, Politigram now is quite different. People are spread out. Obviously, content creators, a lot of people have been deplatformed. This is happening all the time. And it is much, much more, I want to say, sanitized than it
Hmm.
was. So I mean that literally, in that in the years following the publication of that PDF, a lot of people around age 15, teenagers who are too young to drive but are involved in terrorist organizations, a lot of people got arrested. Those were headlines across many of them in Europe, actually, just relatively compared to the U.S. But the Overton window has also shrank proportionately,
Hmm.
in that you are less likely to find someone who has a totally made up ideology that we would call
Yeah.
etiologies, which is this A/B pairing, this combinatory process of putting together a prefix and a suffix, like monarcho syndicalism, for
Hmm.
example, supporting the the hereditary monarch, but also a level of like syndicalist organization at the place of work. There was these things that were really funny and unique to internet culture that would
Hmm.
flourish and crop up in the early Politigram, and now it just feels a little bit different. People have, very specific ideologies, but maybe not th- in the same level of like extreme and self parody that they were before. Yeah, it feels like two different periods.
Hmm. So that's interesting. You're already describing a process in which I don't know whether sanitization is a word I would have used, of course, having not spent the thousands of hours online that you have in the same environment. But I wonder whether we are not already seeing some kind of a commercial capture of all these places of discourse. There's a plenty of ideological conversation and discourse online, and maybe it just happens to be about something else. But I want to dwell a little bit at something that you remarked on a moment ago, which is that the super young age of the actors involved in what you term the politogram around, I guess, 2016. We're at a point of Trump's election, where, of course, for so many people, supposedly the world turns upside down. What does radicalization mean in this context? Like, how do you radicalize someone who doesn't
Mm,
yet have a political consciousness, and to what
right.
feasible end? And I guess underneath that, there's a question of what kind of aims this meme culture might have had. What do? You've hung out at the mall, you've posted all your memes, you've done your shit posting. What are you being radicalized into? For what mission?
Right, right. Yeah, there's let me do these one at a time because this part is really important. So
Mhm.
there's radical politics and there's extremist politics. Sometimes it's helpful to have a rhetorical distinction between those things. Um, Extremist politics is violence and terrorism, which is indefensible and should not be part of political discourse in any civilized society. Then there's radical politics, which radical politics now was common sense politics in the 1970s. So
Yeah.
it's important to spread a gradation on these things. And very often there will be establishment figures that use the fuzzy edges of those words to lump in the extremes with the radicals, and they will discredit things that would otherwise be generally popular and beneficial to society at large. Okay, so the other question is point very well taken that there's a lot of kids who think they're really radical, and it ends up that well, they're just hanging out at the mall and they're shit posting or whatever. Maybe they're not at the mall now, but they're hanging out in the their mom's basement, for example, which I streamed from for about a year, maybe a year and a half. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, that was that was an interesting moment for the personal brand. Uh, in the last few years, in terms of this process of politicization and radicalization, there's a diagram that many people have probably seen now, which is sometimes called the funnel, where you have a broad net of political messaging that is then slowly refined to a more
Mm,
narrow audience and a more narrow audience that gets increasingly radical and extreme. So one could imagine that a political message that reached, say, a million people could then get 1,000 that really meant it, were really dedicated. And when things go viral, that process, that kind of conversion rate, the click through rate in terms of
mhm.
advertising, um, it's funny. The funnel is used in both advertising and
Yeah.
counterterrorism. Those are the
I was
two.
thinking about advertising as you were saying this, frankly,
Exactly.
but
Yeah. No, no, they literally draw the same
mm,
diagrams
wow.
of click-through rates and conversion rates
Mm,
and yeah. So, most people who are exposed to this kind of stuff think it's funny, ironic, entertaining, and they do more or less hanging out at the mall as
yeah.
maybe our generation would, but for them it's posting on social media. But then there is a small percentage of people who really, really do get into it. And part of the work I've done in the last few years is to interview people who have gone from basically looking at memes and reading PDFs and watching YouTube videos into joining political organizations and are now
Mm,
parts of protests, parts of street demonstrations, parts of political organizations where they are taking on they're taking the baton from a group that
yeah.
kind of petered out in the 1990s, and it's a bunch of
Mm,
70-year-olds on Zoom who are now really surprised that there's a bunch of like 16, 17-year-olds in their meetings who are very excited about what's going on and want to hear about left communism and whatever. So there's a real gradation in the severity of this messaging and how activated people get. So absolutely agree that most people, when they get exposed to radical stuff, they kind of don't do much about it. But then there is a portion of it that are really influential online and are very dedicated to it.
right. So I'm already split a little bit trying to follow you, because we talked about this kind of super concentrated, super niche research, super niche type of activity, but actually at the same time we're talking about a set of political techniques, the online culture, meme sphere, as influenceable as it is, and as much as it bears a relationship with mainstream commercial advertising, it also has this potentially massive, massive reach. And I guess it is super interesting to see. And what I imagine, what I understand you've been doing is to try to find ways to influence these political machinations without necessarily going the whole Cambridge Analytica route of subverting, going through Facebook advertising algorithms. I think maybe to try to understand who we're trying to talk to and what it is that we might be trying to talk to them about, it would be good to undo a little bit your second bit of your title, which is the post-left. Now, again, we're talking in May 2022. I've had a bit of a political awakening in the last couple of years, which has made me much more receptive to all sorts of terms with the word post stuck in front of it. But what, for the purposes of the kind of analysis that you think is relevant now, what could the post-left have been in 2018? What is it now? And what do we do with that concept?
That's a great question because it really became such a term that I didn't anticipate it. So as I mentioned before, there's these, various eras of politogram, but certainly in the beginning, what post-left meant then and what it was, in my understanding, historically associated with, I mean, historically among a small group of experts, was that the post-left meant Luddism, it meant anarcho-primitivism,
Mm,
it meant anti-civilization, it meant rejecting industrial society. So you might think of characters all the way from John Zerzan to Kevin
mhm,
Tucker to Derek Jensen up to Ted Kaczynski or
yeah,
anybody, that they were post-left in that their understanding of left-wing politics was that it was essentially the countervailing force that maintained capitalism. I should mention that I disagree with this analysis, but I'm just presenting their version of it. And so they would understand that if you just went hands off, that capitalism would self-destruct, and
yeah,
that civilization would self-destruct, and that we shouldn't attempt to save it, and that we should return to something like a neo-band society of
mm,
hunter-gatherers living off the abundance of the land and things like this. Now, post-left means something very different, which I think, if I broadly had to summarize it, would be people who come from a lineage of organization or left intellectualism who are now very skeptical of like woke politics
mhm,
and do not fit comfortably into the William F. Buckley version of the right because they have
yeah,
pretty strong criticisms of the free market, but they're also not culturally progressive in every instance.
mhm,
So that has kind of, I think, now shifted what the consensus definition of post left is. But when I first wrote about it in 2018, it meant like rejecting industrial society and returning to
yeah.
like, yeah, living off of the land.
I think one of the reasons that online cultures like the ones that you are interested in are eschewed by mainstream academia is that it becomes very difficult for researchers or observers, or even often, I would argue, participants, to figure out which version of the politics they're really participating in. And there's
Mm,
this kind of assumption, which I think one can do, or one can make almost on an aesthetic level, that whenever meme culture develops into a level of irony and absurdity, and that's the thing that we really mean by shit posting, it becomes very difficult to tell whether it pertains to the left or to the right. And I'm pretty sure that's something that you've had to deal with as a description of your practice or an interrogation of your practice. But just to give you a kind of potent and maybe an understudied example, but when you talk about anarcho-primitivism and this kind of idea of returning to
mm,
hunter-gatherer societies, the thing that comes to mind to most people who have been looking at alternatives to mainstream politics, I mean, the person that comes to mind is Bronze Age pervert, where we're not really looking to the left in by any possible means. That's something that I'm kind of troubled by in how we develop approaches to even studying online cultures. And I guess it also ties into the question of radicalization. And maybe if I can go into the next question, is like where you see your intervention into all of this.
hmm Yeah, there's near infinite slippage with the terms and the subcultures, and that's kind of how they all thrive, right? Because they're competing over the definitions of certain words, and they'll literally be competing over which faction owns a hashtag, because that is again creating a very effective
Mm,
advertising funnel to bring in new followers and new recruits to their ideology. they'll also compete over symbols, which we saw a lot, where this is, I think, people from our background who are involved in art, that this is somewhere that artists should be really involved in shaping the discourse, because
Hmm.
you're having a debate between political factions over what an image means. That's like extraordinary. That's so interesting. I think academia has a problem of there's a reason why institutions move slowly. And
Hmm.
these movements, if you started a PhD to write about it, by the time you finish the program, the movement may disappear or it would be something
Well, I
else.
guess your book is partly victim of that as well, as you acknowledged. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote it and I thought there would be a lot more. I thought this would be like a genre of like just,
Mm.
this meme stuff is so interesting. And yeah, I don't know. I just expected to not have to do this for so many years after, but here I am. Okay, but there's another part of the question of not being sure what side you're participating on. I think the indeterminacy is part of it, and yeah, and plotting those routes where, say, for example, somebody gets into what would be a reasonable pathway through this, that like they're really interested in anarcho-primitivism and then they get into Bronze Age pervert at some point later, a few years later. Those things are really interesting to me. How someone can
Hmm.
be acculturated or educated or whatever word, but they start at one position, which we would broadly construe as the right or on the left, and then at some point they cross over, and it's like, what are the pathways between those things? That mapping of the networks and mapping of political ideologies is very fascinating to me.
So a book of yours that I haven't actually seen, but I've seen a cover and admired the cover of, called 20 Interviews, where I think you actually went and interviewed a lot of these key meme makers. But I'd like to ask you about, I mean, how you went about trying to figure out what it is that the meme creators you spoke to actually believe in. Like, at what point
Mm.
do you subject their statements and the ideas, which I imagine are not always expressed in the most kind of sociologically robust terms? How do you go about fact checking what is that they try to propose?
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. There's a whole gamut. And let's say, for example, if you were going to approach an ethnography of like meme posters on Instagram who have political leanings, you would have a book that's like, I mean, it would be the fucking encyclopedia. Like it would be so
Mm.
extensive. So I chose to interview 20 people from the right, left, up, down, and sideways, all across the political
Yeah.
spectrum. So I tried to get a broad cross section of the groups, and I gave them pretty much the same interview format, which is
Mhm.
pretty lengthy. Um, and I asked them to take a few
Mhm.
multiple choice questions that are from the political compass test, but also eight values and politiscales and a number of these. Imagine them like what Harry Potter character quiz are you? Like, are you which Sex in the City character are you? But then it spits out a political ideology at the end.
Yeah.
It's essentially that for people who are not familiar. So, um, the book also includes people who have varying degrees of political commitment. So there's some of them who are members of, say, for example, a communist organization. And then there's other people who are on the early side of this funnel who are, 15 years old and kind of like the shit posting quality of like a Pepe type of a meme. And then there's other people who, since the publication of that book, have now gone on to become members of political organizations. So they're kind of they were in the middle of that
Mhm.
process and they were becoming politically activated. So um, I think this is just in hindsight. I don't know if I fully understood the what I was doing at the time, but to get that level of access to people is actually very, very rare. And I think the only reason I was able to do that was because I was an artist and not a journalist. And I wasn't really, I mean, I was a content creator, but I had like
Mhm.
1,500 listeners on a podcast. So it was a very small thing in the very beginning of the project. But generally, I think people in this space are extremely distrustful of
Yeah.
academics and journalists and anybody who's an outsider. So maybe a testament of just how much time I've spent ruining my brain in the gutters of the internet is that these people will talk to me and be very candid about what they're thinking and how their ideas and worldview are transforming.
Well, you're halfway through a PhD by this point. You've got your data. But actually, look, you've just outed yourself again as an artist, and I think that's a good way to ask you about two things. One of them is maybe to get you to pin your colors to the mast a little bit of your own politics and your own political aspirations, which I imagine is a easier question than some of the others. But second, it's to do with your relationship with the art world and its aesthetic means. So the way I've understood what it is that you're doing is that you, having used your privilege as an artist, you've gained access to certain types of spaces, and you are performing something that the art world would struggle to necessarily understand as an artistic practice. But actually, as you were describing your participation in online forums and so on, actually, I was wondering whether it isn't to a certain extent, a social practice. What we see
Mm.
artists kind of routinely doing, intervening in communities, quite often for the benefit of a sponsor or an aim that is dictated by a foundation or by whatever values a commissioning organization, a museum or so brings with it. But I wonder whether there isn't a way of thinking about what you do that's somehow parallel. And that's not to diminish what you do, because I mean, anyone who has listened to me for a while knows that I have quite a lot of critique for social practice. But the question rather is to do with where that leaves you vis-a-vis the rest of the art world, because you're doing things that are kind of no longer really easily digestible by the art world. And maybe that doesn't matter to you anymore at all.
Yeah, yeah. It's well, let's do these one at a time, and then maybe I'll do the ideology reveal at the end. But let's talk about the art world first. No, this is super interesting, and this was, I think, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because I think in this process I have learned a lot about the role that art plays in society, and that has been shifting a lot, I guess,
Mm,
since before I was alive, even, but now it is something that is really ramped up, and the severity has increased quite a bit. So I think the stuff that I'm doing is, I kind of just consider myself as like a weird creative guy who likes to do projects and gets interested in things, and I
mhm,
don't have a like deep reverence for the canon of art. I mean, like, I respect it and I enjoy it, but there's some people who idolize the canon and think of themselves as being in a very specific lineage of artistic practice and a certain mode of color field painting, or what have you, and I don't necessarily identify with that. I
mhm.
feel like the ideal conditions for me would be to live in a society that had such abundance that I could more or less drop out of the workforce. I could kind of have a part time job and just have a bunch of decommodified time to pursue my weird creative projects. And that would be ideal. Um, so it's been very interesting to me how my involvement with art and my involvement with institutions has given me the credibility to make public statements about how people get politicized. And it's just a very unique period that we're in. Art is the professional field that doesn't abide by the standards and disciplines of any other field. So if I was
Mhm.
purely an academic or purely a journalist, I kind of wouldn't be able to do all the things that I do. All of that being said, we're now in a period of historical development and uh, art and cultural institutions being folded into polite and elite society in such a way that it's completely professionalized.
Yeah.
And I'm primarily crowdfunded. I've built a practice and a content stream on Patreon. There's a handful of artists that came from post internet that have been able to make that leap. There's essentially
Yeah.
Josh. There's New Models. There's Brad Trammell. There's interdependence, but all of these people were broadly, in that post-internet generation, who then made a leap to platforms and
Yeah.
out of the institution. Like, I literally left my job at the university to become a content creator on the platforms. So uh, it's expensive and it damages your career because you often don't get invited back. And I think one of the things that made that easier is that I think, not even really outspoken political leanings, but we live in an extremely unequal society, and
Mhm.
yeah, that has certain conflicts with the donor structures of museums, and there has to be a level of inequality for patronage to
Yeah.
exist. So yeah, those become very tricky things to navigate in the art world. And I probably did a lot of shit posting in my younger years that got me disinvited to a few dinners for sure. I mean, literally got me
I
disinvited
see.
to
I
some,
waited for my
yeah.
40s to start being vocally opposed to everything and everyone.
But let me throw the
Mm.
just the to make this into like now a 4D problem
Mm.
is I feel like the common sense politics of social democracy are extremely unpopular right now in cultural institutions. And
Yeah.
there's almost like a bell curve of an effect where there are politics that are so extreme that they are unpopular. Most people don't like them, don't support them. And those things are very generously invited into the institutions. So the idea that, we're perpetually living in 2016 in the US, just forever, forever forward. But the idea that people who went out and voted for Donald Trump might have been amenable and might have voted for Bernie Sanders had there been a different
Yeah.
candidate, that idea is so dangerous to the donor class of the museums that
Yeah.
work associated with those, what I would say are common sense, popular politics, pose a pretty significant threat to the credibility and the elite status position of the people whose names are
Mm.
on the donor walls. So I've said this, till I'm blue in the face, but it cannot be repeated enough because it really has shaped the last few years of internet culture discourse in the professional art world, and that there has
Yeah.
been absolute silence on the most influential, most widely viewed images in maybe the history of mankind that shaped politics and discourse. Newspapers, documentaries, every other facet and medium of cultural production has extensive work relating to these topics, and the art world has been totally silent. So that tells you something.
Yeah, I mean, that becomes unsupportable after any length of contemplation of the artwork's reaction to the election of Trump. I've never seen an industry of people who see themselves as influential be so powerless in its, not even in its effect, but rather in its ability to formulate its position using its
Yes.
own language. Okay, well, I would be tempted to continue to think about you as an artist, but actually, forgetting all of that, since you've used the term content creator, I wanted to ask you about some of the practical ways you create content. And by that, I mean essentially the way that you enact your intervention. So, apart from spending lots of time online, you've got your own Discord server where presumably you do your own community organizing, but you also, I imagine, spend a lot of time lurking around other places that are not necessarily yours or friendly to you, but you also do a bunch of other quite visible things, like you made a couple of videos for a platform called Dis, which I highly recommend to listeners. You've just staged an exhibition that you told me about a couple of weeks ago. And you also write in forms other than books. You have a blog called Do Not Research, which I think you run collaboratively. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about what role these different media engagements play in your political, small bracket, artistic project, whichever one it is.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few different legs to the tripod, or maybe it's a octopod now. I don't know. I'm over. We're all overemployed now.
Mm.
Um, So I still think of myself as an artist, but I haven't really had the time to really sit down and make, I
Mm.
used to make these big like 12-foot tableau scenes of like just diligently putting together a scene over like 6 months. And I miss that, but I'm not doing that for a
Mhm.
while. So there is the content stream. I published my syllabus to Patreon, a group of mostly young, mostly art students collected in the Discord. They started creating work that we published to this blog called Do Not Research. Do Not Research has, let me see if I know the numbers, 143 posts by 110 contributors in 11 months. So
Mm.
the volume of work associated with these topics by young art people seems to be influenced that it is popular and it is relevant, but it hasn't been represented in the mainstream of art.
Yeah.
The exhibition that we just mounted was curated out of the Discord server in the Share Your Work channel. So 90% of it comes from that, and then there were a few other
Mhm.
pieces, odds and ends from different places. But it's all community members. Certain people we recruit to publish on the blog, and then their membership to the community is compensated. It's complimentary. If they're in the community, then they get reimbursed for the fees. So it's a
Mhm.
$5 barrier to entry, which keeps out people who aren't very interested and results in a very dedicated, very productive community. If you contribute to the blog, you should be a member for free. That sounds fair. Like the
Mhm.
magazine, when you write for them, they send you the issue. I think that's
Oh, the number of times that has not happened for me, I'm not going
sometimes
to
it's very
say.
it's like 3 months later, six
Yeah.
months later. Yeah, yeah. There's a few other legs to this project, but it's one of the reasons I'm so, aggressive on these things is because through going out onto the platforms, I realized how precarious and how terrible the discourse actually was on those things, like the incentives and the clickbait and the sensationalism and just the amount of fucking selfies you have to do. It's really I have become nostalgic for the old institutional structures, but now, kind of as we had mentioned before, my sense is that the institutions are not fixable. Like they are totally
Hmm.
captured by elite interests that have pretty steadfast. I mean, these are literally the donors to the Democratic Party. So if you want to visibly support an insurgent candidate within the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
you're at odds. Okay, so I think that the move now is to exit the platforms and to rebuild new institutions. That's the long arc that I'm on, and I'm trying to pursue these things, very aggressively to take on more than I can really accomplish with the blog and the exhibition and the content stream, because I think this is an opportunity. It's a pretty unique historical moment that we could build something long lasting and important if we play our cards right. And
Okay, so the ambition
yeah.
is pretty high here. I see. Tell me more about the community. Like, who are these people, and what do you think brings them all? Kind of wondering about the role of you as this kind of charismatic leader creator, and you one of a whole crop of people of your generation. Justin Murphy comes to mind, even though he has a very different political set of ideas, but he's also talks about community, and I think has been very successful in bringing a bunch of people who are intellectually and politically inclined together, also behind a technological platform. The meaning of the word community and what people contribute and what their understanding of the transaction is quite interesting
Mm,
to try
mm.
to try to grasp.
Yeah, yeah, it's a new period of the internet. Yeah, and it's exciting. I think for us, it's very easy because membership to the community is pegged to a contribution on the blog, more or
Hmm.
less, in that there's a private chat of all of the blog contributors. There's no way to buy your way into that chat. You have to make a cultural work, whether that's an image or an essay or what
Hmm.
have you, that has to pass the curatorial approval of myself and our two editors. That core membership is attached to your creative work. But I know there's a lot of other communities that just have a very vibrant discourse,
Yeah.
and it's like tweets and it's banter and it's chatting in the Discord, and we have all of those things too. But I think it's a lot of work to wrangle. It's a lot of work to manage these things, and the people, I mean, you can't see me on the podcast, but like, if you're not familiar, like, I look like a fucking jock and like a shit posting jock. And I think all of the people, or I assume that all the people who would come to the community would be like, angry young white men like me. And it transformed my way of understanding myself actually in making the project, because the people who came to the community were, many of them, like much more radically left than I am even,
Hmm.
and many of them queer, many of them of the marginalized identity groups that should benefit from the elite, interests of the institutions, but they work jobs that are very precarious, and so they're painting with broad strokes here.
Hmm.
They don't benefit from the elite identity politics that has been so predominant in the media class and in cultural institutions. So they're creatives themselves. They're really talented. They're making work in a field that is unsupported by the institutions that they should be benefiting from. And so all of those things combine to produce a very unique type of community. So we have people from, mostly moderate to radical left politics, and then we have a few just like reactionary trolls in the Discord, which are now like, it's like, oh, Juan is posting, he's shit posting in the memes channel again, and it's like really hilarious and charming. That's a good one. It's a pretty unique space on the internet.
So how many people do you gather in those kind of spaces? Like, just what are the nuts and bolts of this operation? Just
Yeah,
literally for people who've never encountered this,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
this would be interesting to consider.
So let's say the number of people who contribute to the blog is 110. The Discord
Hmm.
is probably 1,500 or something like that.
Hmm.
And then there are certain content creators who are members of the community who reach audiences in the millions. And then there's, say, for example, a piece that I wrote in the Guardian that was on top of the opinion page for a day and a half. That is in the millions.
Yeah.
There's a real funnel effect to the messaging that is concentrated in a core community and then has this amphitheater effect. So, yeah, the Discord itself, 1,500.
Interesting. And the question of the left's complete loss of infrastructure. These are models that are worth exploring. And at the very least, which is one of the things that you point to, these are mechanisms, these are ways of building communities and political support that have been successful for the opposition. They've been pretty damn successful for the
Mm,
right and various factions of the extreme right.
mm.
Going back to the blog to do that research, well, I read one of your recent texts called "How to Plant a Meme," which I think would be quite an interesting case study of
Oh boy.
what it is that one can actually do in these spaces, and then it's an interesting way to try to visualize the actual process of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and by the means you're doing it, and also its limitations and its kind of horizons.
Just as a piece of background, because I don't know when this is going to be published, but it's been an exciting 2 weeks on the internet.
Mm,
I've never seen nothing I've ever written or published has activated that dedicated of an audience.
mhm,
And it just keeps it's like waves, just like people come in with insane messages and takes and comments. And yeah, I've done a few talks and things that'll be coming out about that essay soon. So let me give you the short version of it, and then because otherwise I could just tell the story for infinite amount of time. It's a long story. So I published Politigram the Post-left in October of 2018. After publishing that, I then started an anonymous meme project spread out across a few platforms. I continued that for about 18 months. When I finished that project, I then became a content creator. 8 months into being a content creator,
mhm,
I told the story. The story is on a podcast in 2020. In 2022, I transcribed that podcast and
yeah,
published it as an essay. And so now people are going back, I don't know, like 3 years or so to this project I did, which is now, going soft viral and activating all of these like fanatically dedicated meme communities and discords.
mm,
But essentially, there's this unanswered question. If you see something that you think is a net social ill, you see something that you're opposed to, do you just stand on the sidelines? Do you do something about it, or what's
yeah,
what's the course of action? At the end of the book, at Politigram the Post-left in the print version only, there is a level of nihilist terrorism and
mhm,
advocating violence against unarmed, apolitical civilians, and it's just completely indefensible. I have to define that. So when we talk about de-radicalization, we're talking about people into extremist
yeah,
politics, like you know, instructions for how to make improvised explosive devices, distributing the writings of active terrorist groups in these Discord channels in 2018. So when I talk about de-radicalizing, it's something that is, uh, in need of it. So the project, which was an experiment that I didn't know if it would work, was to try and wield influence in these spaces by slowly introducing more positive references in a gradation, what I called in the essay a reference chain, that you could get them
mhm.
into from Ted Kaczynski, you could get them into Nick Land. If you could get them into Nick Land, then you could get them into Gilles Deleuze, and then into Sadie Plant, and then you could get to the CCRU, and you could get into Mark Fisher, who is,
Yeah.
one of my favorites. But that process of just acculturating people to ideas was essentially the funnel analogy that we've been trying to map, of like how people get into one thing and then a few years later, A to B to C to D, and then at X, you're like, well, now I'm into some insane niche radical political ideology. How did I even get here? I think there are ways to sculpt those spaces and use them intentionally. And this project was a test deployment of that. So the essay, that it's kind of a lot of meme techniques of like practical ways of putting images together with
Hmm.
artifacts and strategies like that. But it's also the general concept of creating a reference chain and incrementally introducing people to ideas over time. What then really transforms the project is that I tell this story 8 months into the podcast stream, and then the community in the Discord produces hundreds upon hundreds of capitalist realism memes.
Yeah.
Just to the extent that Mike Watson wrote, well, he titled his book after it. There
Well,
are
indeed, I interviewed Mike only a couple of weeks ago. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes.
two other books, one of which has the same name, that show all of those memes, and it's, I mean, they're 200 to 300 pages each, and I've folders and folders of them. So what happened, down the line is that seeding that meme of just capitalist realism, kind of pasting the logo over things, photoshopping it
Hmm.
into different scenes, it catches on, and people who are not aware that this is like a project to force meme something, they
Yeah.
just start repeating it themselves because it's a very popular book, it's very relevant, and we're just creating like the visual language to propel that on a visual platform like Instagram. Yeah, so I took everything that I do now as we're telling this
Hmm.
story is this trickle of work over a long period of time, because that's what the content schedule is. If I did a yearly exhibition, it would all be
Yeah.
cohesive and one thing at a time, but everything I do is spread out over months and years, and it's this evolving story. That's just, I guess, the nature of the mediums that we work in now. Yeah, so the essay that was published, I want to say, it might have been a month ago now. It could have been a while. Um, that is more or less a direct transcript of what I read on the podcast in 2020, and people are losing their minds over it. They're totally melting down. So it's been
Hmm.
interesting.
Well, I'm clearly not part of these communities enough to have taken it quite like that. I read it as a very sober kind of manual for,
Thank
how
you.
to
That's
how to deal with, with the unknown, how to try to influence people using quite modest memes, of
that's what
course.
I
Um,
that's what I thought. Yeah.
if I was a better journalist, I would have already interrupted you and asked you the gotcha question. Did you also publish a book called The Meaning of Mark Fisher?
Oh no, there's a content creator called Academic Fraud who
Hmm.
did who I think, if I can remember back to when it started, was trying to preempt the SEO to like ride on top of the the other book.
That's just something that Mike Watson happened to remark on, and I guess from a perspective of someone like him, that was a bizarre thing to experience. But I imagine it's testament to the fact that all these forces that you enter, you don't necessarily control to any great degree. This is possibly why academia can't really touch quite a lot of these
It's
subjects.
total
And
anarchism.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. People, Academic Fraud is, I mean, a great account that does a lot of really brilliant projects. But there's people who are, in the community, have their own autonomous practice, and yeah, it's kind of like trying to ride the chaos and direct it when you can. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay, what's your responsibility as this de facto leader, as the de facto charismatic leader, and in
Uh,
the
I think it's primarily at this point,
mm,
it's to try and manage the scarce resources and to try and raise money and to try and facilitate. I'm like literally installing people's work on the wall, like I'm drilling into
mhm,
brick and like hanging their art, um, coordinating institutional projects. We're printing out a year of the blog of Do Not Research, and we're going to launch that at the new museum in, I think, 3 weeks from now. So I'm
mhm,
I'm organizing that. We're going to do a screening series of several films by contributors to the blog in July. So it really is like, I guess I'm just trying to recreate the same like pathways to a creative life that have been disappearing in American society. Like everything, we
yeah,
don't even have a space to meet. We have to meet in a Zoom room. We don't have like a room to meet for a reading group. So I feel like my job now has been to like manage, facilitate opportunities to give visibility and to like enshrine these works in an institutional context and argue for like why showing certain memes and
mm.
conversations are important. And yeah, I really feel like, I don't know, I wasn't a lecturer or a writer before this. I was just a guy in the studio. That's how I thought my practice would be. But now I'm some type of a, I don't know, I guess I was a teacher, so it's not that surprising.
Well, we all get to join the PMC one way or another. Sorry, Joshua. um, how does it all end? You end the book by talking about the inevitability of the black pill,
Mm,
the nihilism that draws pretty much every participant of any political or politicizable online community. Where do you see salvation to through what you're doing?
mm, mm. Well, there's the ending to the book in 2018, and then there's an ending in the 2021 version. In 2018, I very much felt like the end point was the black pill, in that there was not much further that you could radicalize, um, but in the time following its publication, I have seen a lot of people just age out of it. And they were
Mm,
part of really extreme groups before, and then you know what? They go to college and they learn that it's actually fun to drink and hang out with your friends, or you get a girlfriend, or just other things like you get a job. There are things that like take up your time that when you're a depressed teenager, um, it's at a level of extremism that I don't think our generations had easy access to. You know,
mm,
so that part of it is shocking. Um, I think it's a gradation as well. I know people who depoliticized and then got into health food, and now they spend a lot of time like
uh,
eating raw beef and whatever. So there are various routes. Some people get organized. Some people start families. I've followed many stories in the last few years. I think how it ends for us, for the community side of the project, is that I don't know. Hopefully, I've seen so much of internet culture disappear in the last 10 years that I've been doing this. The only things that really remain durable is if you have some type of institutional context to like
mm.
gather the interest and archive itself and whatever. So I feel like that's the path that we're trying to embark on, and hopefully we're successful. But there's a lot to be determined between now and then. So fingers crossed.
Well, good luck. I think what you're doing is kind of part of any cultural evolution. I would imagine historically every subcultural group has a feeling that it's sort of
Mm.
outside the main purview of academia of history. But what you seem to be doing seems to be catching on. For all our listeners who didn't understand half of the terminology, I apologize. I'm going to put a bunch of links to Josh's Patreon, his Instagram, his essays, and a bunch of other things. Do click. I don't have an ending anymore. I don't have an ending, Joshua. I
That's
think.
good. That's good. It means we're growing onward and upward.
Yeah,
We're charging
you've
forward.
confused me. I've read your books. I've watched your videos. You've confused me enough to not know how to sign this off. Thank you for joining me, Joshua.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Politigram and the Post-left, as well as 20 questions, are available on Amazon. I'll end this episode by playing the audio track of The Slow Red Pill, which is a video work made by Joshua in collaboration with Jacob Hervitz Goodman for the online educational and information platform DIS. This film looks at the ways in which the far right can intermingle and exchange information with run-of-the-mill conservatism in online platforms. This process, I think, is equivalent to the things we discuss in the interview, except that, of course, it points in the opposite political direction. Do keep listening, but I'll sign off now. I'm Pierre Delancey, and here was my chapeau.
I once followed a group of far-right teenagers on Instagram who devoted much of their time to radicalizing people. The strategy was simple. They'd set up meme pages that, on the surface, appeared to be run-of-the-mill Republican MAGA-type accounts. The bio might read, "Free speech, debate welcome, make America great." By all outward appearances, it would look like a regular conservative meme page. This account would repost high-performing content from big Republican pages, like DC Drano, The Typical Liberal, etc., and use the popularity of these images to accumulate a following of Fox, Breitbart, and Turning Point USA type viewers. About once a week, the account would unexpectedly post extreme content, while regular posts would feature familiar conservative tropes like having an iPhone means you can't criticize capitalism, and Venezuela proves that socialism doesn't work. extreme posts would contain racist caricatures and anti-capitalist messaging in favor of white identity. This type of extreme racist post was frequently met with pushback from the community. Common responses included, "People should be treated as individuals, not as part of a group," and "The Democrats are the ones who want to divide us up by race." Implicit or explicit gestures of anti-Semitism were strongly protested by evangelical Christians. Red pill posts would rarely stay up long. In most cases, they were only intended to appear on one's Instagram feed and to vanish shortly after. The account would then resume posting popular content, wait another week, and try it again. This process would continue for months, maybe a year. By posting mainstream conservative content most of the time, these extreme right groups were able to build up an audience numbering in the range of 30 to 40,000, which they could then incrementally expose to radical content. Towards the end of the account's lifespan, the admins would dial up the ratio of radical content dramatically. Posts would frame shifting demographics as a great replacement, orchestrated by nefarious transnational elites, or describe how climate change would soon force hard decisions about the distribution of scarce resources in the global north. Ultimately, they would put forward that, against the scale of the coming crisis, civil unrest and violence were not only permissible, but necessary. At this point, the pages would be banned rather quickly. A large follower count vastly increases the likelihood of reports. But in the time of building up that following, they would have successfully moved a large portion of their audience significantly further towards the right. This was always the true objective. Getting banned was an acceptable and anticipated casualty. The following week, they would make a new account and start over. The common reaction among many of today's liberals and centrists to this growing proliferation of far-right material online is to call for greater action from Silicon Valley giants. But attempts to combat this type of content are always necessarily on the back foot. In recent years, debates over moderation and algorithmic recommendation have worked to obscure the true source of radicalization, an atomized and precarious society in which increasing numbers of people are unable to access the benefits of the mainstream, and, as a result, now move to the political fringes. There is no content moderation solution for a political problem. Returning from a recent account ban, one of the main admins wrote, "I'm happy to be back, guys. Remember, as long as I remain on this earth, I will never stop shitposting for you lads. I'm on my 18th account." Perhaps it is time to accept that this kind of political mobilization is here to stay. In the past, young people were politicized through radical movements and underground subcultural spaces. But today, platforms have caused all countercultural scenes to sublimate and recollect online. Meme pages, influencers, and online groups aren't going anywhere. There is nothing implicitly right-wing about the slow red pill strategy. Swapping normie meme accounts into political content is an effective tactic. Anyone can use it. But instead of extreme content, one might choose to show declining rates of union membership, the divergent trend lines of productivity and wages, or the unprecedented upward drift of wealth in the past 40 years. As the center is vacated by disillusioned masses, whether they look to the left or the right for alternatives is largely up to us.